movement society that Meyer and I wrote about a decade ago may be increasing the gap in participation between rich and poor, between those who are well-networked and those who are not. Even well-equipped guerrilla groups and terrorist organizations have mastered the technical skills of the internet, but ordinary individuals have not. And this takes me to the next meaning of the movement society, what I call warring results. In Western Europe, skinheads have gained support from people suffering from rising unemployment and anti-immigrant hatred. In the Middle East and South Asia, Islamist violence has spread to the capitalist core, drawing on the alienation of second-generation immigrants from South Asia and the Middle East. Elsewhere, guerrilla movements continue to organize against authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes. From these forms of violent contention, Latin America has not been immune. Building a unique data set of contentious performances in 7 Latin American countries, James Franklin found a worryingly high proportion of his events involving violence. For the average of the countries he studied, 1/3 of the events were violent attacks on persons. Another 10% were violent protests. 2% were forceful seizures of property. Another 5% were destructive challenges. Only 1/5 of the events he studied over this 20-year period were various forms of non-violent challenges, and another 28% were what he called symbolic protests. Now you will be pleased to learn that the proportions were reversed for Brazil, with 15% for the 4 violent forms, 38% for the 3 non-violent forms, and 47% for what Franklin called symbolic protests. Brazil appears to be resembling the countries of the North, in which contained and conventional forms of protest have overtaken violent and disruptive forms. The United States has not been lacking in warring movements either. In the West and the Southwest, militant anti-government movements have defied the federal government, attacking churches and Jewish institutions, and attacking immigrants from south of the border. In Oklahoma City, a pair of right-wing militants destroyed a federal building and took the lives of hundreds of citizens. And the recent Supreme Court decision in favor of unlimited gun ownership is bound to increase the amount of death and destruction. The spread of violent, sectarian, and self-enclosed identity movements in both North and South raises troubling questions for social movement theory. What do social movement scholars have to say about it? Strangely enough, from the debate over warring movements, most students of social movements have been absent. Why is this? To some extent, it's the result of the high level of specialization to which the social sciences are prone. To some extent, it's the result of the evolution of the phenomena we study. For example, the PT was a product of social movement politics during the transition to democracy, but today it resembles many catch-all parties. But I think the major reason why social movement scholars have so little to say about this phenomenon of increasingly violent movements is biographical. Many of us became interested in social movements during the reformist protest cycle of the 1960s in the North and during the wave of democratization movements in the South. To the extent that we've allowed these examples of reformist movements and democratic movements to shape our models we will never be able to understand the new wave of warring movements. We need to develop approaches to contentious politics that encompass both the reforming and the democratizing movements of the past and the warring movements of the current day. And this is what the Contentious Politics program tries to do. Is the future movement society going to be conventionalized, or will it dissolve into violence? The evidence is not yet available. On the one hand, we've seen an overall growth in contentious politics. On the other hand, in the North, and apparently in Brazil, it is the least transgressive forms of contention. Peaceful demonstrations, internet petitions that are increasing in numbers, while warring movements are appearing all over the global South. The third possibility is what I consider the most worrying, and that is a growth of both conventional and violent forms of contention in the same countries. What Tilly and I called a composite system in the last book here. It's the interaction between contained and warring movements that worry me the most. In countries in which contained and violent contention exist side by side, state and police strategies of repression are beginning to expand from the repression of violent movements to the control of nonviolent movements. Consider how the police in Europe have dealt with counter-summits. They've adapted the methods that they developed against football violence and organized terrorism to combating transnational protesters. The same techniques that they developed against hooligans at football matches and against the threat of terrorism, they are now beginning to apply to peaceful transnational demonstrators against counter-protests. And Helena and I have been doing research on transnational counter-protests, and it is striking how much more violent the police have become in dealing with these protests than they were against national protests in the 1980s and 1990s. And this takes me to my final and most worrying theme: the expansion and extension of the suppression of protests. How does the repression of warring movements interact with contentious politics? And I want to say a word which struck me in looking at the schedule to this seminar. I do not read the Portuguese well, but I read enough to have understood what the topics of most of the sessions were. And I could be wrong, but I only found 2 sessions in which the topic of public security was dealt with. Now, this is not a criticism of my hosts. It is a criticism of the social movement field in general. It is more true in the United States than it is in Latin America. We study social movements because we like social movements. We identify with social movements. Many of us come from social movement backgrounds. We do not like the police. We do not, for the most part, come from police backgrounds. And when we look at social movement campaigns, it's very difficult to avoid the conclusion that the interaction that's most important is between movement activists and the forces of order. Yet we do not have any theoretical models to help us to understand the variations and the dynamics of the relations between social movements and the forces of order. I'm not sure why this is, but it may be because we're so interested in the actors, whether new actors or old actors, that we neglect studying the interactions between them and their opponents.